Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we are discussing Chapter 6 of Basic Income, a radical proposal for a free society and a sane economy by Philippe von Parijs and Yannick Vanderborght. So Chapter 6 is entitled Economically Sustainable, Funding, Experiments, and Transitions. So a question we can kind of start with is, what does it mean for basic income to be economically sustainable in the first place? How does it compare to other mechanisms of providing consumers with money? And what would it mean for basic income not to be economically sustainable? And my sense is that this question is really about, what level of basic income is optimal for the economies to sustain. It's less of a sense of, can basic income work at all or not? You might believe that the optimal rate of basic income for the economy is zero. And then you have to ask the question, well, what mechanisms are you using to get people their money? And I think the answer today, you can kind of look around and see that we're doing some pretty inefficient stuff with kind of overstimulating the financial sector and creating jobs unnecessarily as a way of pushing money to consumers. So basic income can be an alternative to that. So, these guys, they are not thinking about it that way. They're thinking about basic income first as something that's kind of desirable to do. And then once you've decided that you want to do it, figure out if you can do it or something like that, which is kind of the opposite way that I think about it. I think, oh, well, we can afford to give people money for free. How much of that can we do? How much of that is best for the economy? So they're definitely kind of coming at it from a different angle. So let's get into the first quote from the book here. So let's see. Of course, it is part of the purpose of a basic income to enable women and men to reduce or interrupt their paid work, or to opt for less remunerative but more gratifying employment, or to settle with their employers for remuneration in terms of work quality rather than pay. Basic income supporters can welcome all this unless it dries up the source on which the funding of basic income depends. So this is an interesting point. I don't know that I would frame it this way. I don't know that I would say that part of the purpose of basic income is to enable people to reduce their employment. I would say that some of these other mechanisms that we use to get people money force people to do unnecessary work as a way of getting them money. And basic income is just kind of back to normal, or kind of like if you're imagining normal as like efficient labor markets where you're only paying people for the product of their labor, that kind of thing. And then there's this question of dries up the source of funding on that basic income depends on. So that's a little bit different from how I think about it too. I think there are contexts in which you could think about basic income this way. If you're trying to implement basic income at the level of a city or kind of a small state that doesn't kind of manage its own currency, that kind of thing. But then what you're really doing there is you're using taxes to kind of change the level of basic income the economy can sustain. And if you're a city, if you're just an individual city, then the level of basic income you can sustain is probably zero if you don't have any taxes and you're not making any other changes to fiscal policy or something like that. But that's not necessarily the case at the level of a bigger government that controls its own money and issues its own currency, that kind of thing. In those cases, that government, the constraint on the spending, right? A really big government can run deficits, and the constraint on that is, well, how much stuff is there for people to buy, right? So you have to have, in order for the economy to work, people have to have a certain amount of money, and it has to be buying or giving them access to buy the economy's output. And you want to buy the economy's output, and you want these flows to be balanced with each other. You want people's spending to be balanced with the amount of stuff they're buying. Otherwise, you get inflation, right? So then it comes into the inflation question. So I think these questions of kind of work incentives and potentially inflation are not separate questions. They kind of treat them as separate questions in this chapter. But the reality is that if people have more money to spend, that affects the demand side of things. And if people have less incentive to work, that affects the supply side of things. And then inflation occurs when, there's a mismatch between supply and demand. So the supply shrinks relative to the demand, or the demand grows relative to the supply. But it's still ultimately about, are you keeping the pattern of consumer spending matched up with the pattern of economic output? And you can ask these questions for any mechanism that you're using to get people their money, right? If you give people too much money, then you have inflation. If you don't give people enough, then you have other problems. So it's not like a basic income specific thing that we're worried about here. But of course, they kind of take that angle in this book. So I'm wondering, has anyone else read the chapter? Does anyone have any initial thoughts? So yeah, so I guess to kind of reiterate what I was saying on that one, the problem isn't really the source of funding drying up. The problem is kind of the source of economic output might dry up if we under-incentivize work. Or the source of economic output will stay there to some extent, but people will be claiming more than the economy can produce. Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah, I read the chapter. I mean, for me, it was a little bit disappointing, just in that for me, one of the biggest things about basic income is its ability to help the economy fully utilize the productive capacity that we're not utilizing. If you look at our economy now versus 200 years ago, the amount of labor supply per capita has, not really changed that much. But the difference in production and the difference in what people are able to have in terms of their wants and needs is enormous. And the reason it's so big is because of capital accumulation and because of technological progress, which I also consider to be a type of capital accumulation. And, I mean, I think a little bit about my views. I think that's, there's just way too much emphasis on labor when labor is just simply not the major production of factor of production anymore.
Yeah, and you'll notice in this chapter, I'm sure you noticed throughout the chapter, that when they talk about the economic sustainability of basic income, all of the questions are about kind of how does it affect the labor market. So is that really an important question we need to ask when discussing basic income as a potential mechanism for getting people their money? And I think the answer is no. Those kinds of things, incentives and stuff like that, those will affect the level of basic income the economy can sustain, but it doesn't affect whether basic income in itself is a good idea. To use that as your mechanism instead of creating jobs for that purpose, or instead of stimulating the financial sector for that purpose. And you mentioned activating the economy's full capacity. It's about that, but it's also about activating it efficiently, right? So you could, any way that you push people money, right? Any way that you get money to consumers, that money is going to give them access to the economy's output capacity. But the question is, are you also wasting their time in the process? Are you creating financial instability in the process? That kind of thing. So I think, if you do it more efficiently, then automatically you're going to be able to squeeze more out of that capacity. You're going to be able to get more output out of the economy. And there are certainly scenarios that we've kind of talked about before where the economy can be vastly underproducing because of the way in which we prop up the price level, and aggregate demand can get all skewed and that kind of thing. So there's certainly it's about how do you get people money efficiently, and money is important for the purpose of activating not just capacity that we haven't been activating yet, but activating the capacity we have as efficiently as possible. So let me go to the next quote here. What happened to my share screen? Oh, I see what I did. Here we go. This risk arises, many economists critical of basic income point out, not so much because of the freedom from obligation of the minimum income guaranteed to all, but above all, because of the taxation its funding requires. So this is an interesting point. I think this is kind of by default how a lot of people think about basic income, that you kind of have to get the money from somewhere, right? Whereas we maybe think about it in the opposite way, which is that, you know, in order for the government to spend, they're adding money to the economy anytime they spend, and there has to be something for them to spend the money on, or there has to be something for the consumers to spend their money on if they're handing the money to consumers. But this is kind of like the mindset that people come at a question of basic income from. Where are you going to get the money from? And that's partly because they're thinking about it kind of by analogy to other kind of government support, social welfare programs, that kind of thing. They're not thinking of it as a macroeconomic policy. They're not thinking of it as the answer to the question of where does the economy get its money in the first place, right? They're thinking of kind of a redistribution or something like that. So I think that can kind of lead people down the wrong path. And in this chapter, they do mention various kind of arrangements, including arrangements that don't involve having to tax anyone, but they don't really kind of get into that. And I think something that can help us think about this is that anytime the government spends, regardless of whether they're balancing against taxes, they're adding money to a part of the economy that didn't have that money before, right? And when they're taxing money away from another part of the economy. If you're adding money and removing it from the exact same place at the exact same time, then you're doing nothing, right? So there is, even if it's kind of a redistribution, you're still kind of, in a sense, adding new money where it wasn't before. And the fact that you're taking money away from somewhere else, depending on how those parts of the economy are connected, they can affect each other differently. Some taxes might increase the level of basic income the economy can sustain. Some taxes might decrease the level of basic income the economy can sustain. So yeah, let me go to the next one here. Worries about the sustainability of basic income have two main sources. The minor one is the risk of inflation. It can be dealt with very briefly. Funding a basic income by redistributing purchasing power within some population, as in most proposals, cannot be expected to generate an overall inflationary pressure, as would funding it by transfers from abroad or by money creation. And my answer to this is yes, it can. If you're taking that money from someone who wasn't going to spend it and giving it to someone who is going to spend it into the kind of the productive economy, that's very similar to adding, like I said, if you're the government is spending, they're adding new money to the economy. And what are they doing on the other side? Are they taxing someone? Are they digging money out of a hole in the ground that wouldn't have been spent, or are they taking it from some rich person who wouldn't have been buying the same kinds of things or using up the same types of resources or amounts of resources that an ordinary consumer would use? If that's the case, then your economy has to have the capacity to sustain that spending, right? Taking money away from rich people isn't going to create that capacity if the rich people weren't activating that capacity to begin with. On the other hand, if you do have the capacity, then you can give people the money, and you don't necessarily need to take any money from anyone anywhere. So it's kind of these things are somewhat disconnected unless you can tell a story about substitution of resource use, about one person's using a resource, now another person's, you freed it up and now another person's using a resource. We can use taxes for that. We can use taxes to free up resources. If you tax resource intensive activities, that frees up those resources for other purposes. And that can certainly increase the capacity of the economy to produce goods and services for ordinary consumers. So, but the key point here is just because you're taking money from one part of the economy and putting it in another part of the economy doesn't mean you're going to prevent inflation. And just because you're adding money to the economy without necessarily taxing anyone doesn't mean you're going to cause inflation, right? You have to look at where the money is flowing from, where it's flowing to, where it's entering the economy, where it's leaving the economy, and all the related incentives involved of the taxation policies or the spending policies. So I just wanted to comment on that. I think they probably understand this, but a lot of people don't. And a lot of people, when they argue for basic income and when they talk about, stuff like Andrew Yang's freedom dividend or something like that, they say, well, it can't cause inflation because you're spending money that's already in the economy. Well, that's not, you're not taking it and giving it back in exactly the same spot at exactly the same time. So it can have an effect. Yeah. So let's go to the next one here. Probably not going to make it all the way through this chapter. I might skip around a bit. To an extent, that will vary greatly with the choices made as to the level of basic income, what it replaces, and exactly how it's funded. So this is a little bit related to what I was talking about. There will be some redistribution from relatively high earners to relatively low earners, especially part-time workers, and to the beneficiaries of low social transfers. Hence, if some goods are, at least in the short term, in inelastic supply, while being and remaining after the reform, more than proportionally purchased by net gainers from the introduction of basic income, some increase in the prices they face, and hence some decrease in the real value of their basic income can be expected. This holds in particular when a basic income is introduced on a large geographical scale. The associated redistributive effect in favor of poorer areas may then boost the price of housing and other local goods, thereby reducing without offsetting the benefit of the redistribution. So this is an interesting point. And a question we can ask is, what if you redistribute from people who are buying goods outside of the market basket that we use to determine the price index and the price level and all of that, to people who are buying goods that are inside the market basket? So even if so it's not, you could have a general increase on the price level. It's not necessarily just going to be, local goods or kind of some goods go up and other goods go down, because you are calibrating the price level, or you're measuring the price level, you're benchmarking it against a basket of consumer goods. And different people buy different stuff. Some people are buying exactly that basket. Some people are buying something, stuff that doesn't really line up with the basket very well. And it tends to be richer people, right, who are kind of buying their luxury items, and that kind of stuff doesn't factor in as much into the price index. So again, the idea of taking from rich people, giving to poor people, not necessarily going to work. You have to have the productive capacity there in order for it to work. So let's just skip to the next one here. This is kind of what I was talking about a little bit before. The possibility of inflation needs to be borne in mind, but does not endanger the sustainability of the scheme. This cannot be said about the second main source of concern about the sustainability of a generous basic income, the negative effect it may have jointly with its funding on economic incentives. So like I was saying before, this is essentially the same question just from the supply side. Reduced incentives mean reduced economic output, means inflation, and you get inflation until the incentives are back in line again, right? So there's a real level of basic income the economy can sustain in terms of real purchasing power. And you want to find what that is. If you find what that is and you set your basic income at that level, at the current price level, then you're not going to get inflation or deflation. And that's going to be, minimally disruptive. If you set the basic income nominally, if you set it too high, then the inflation will bring the purchasing power of the basic income back down to its kind of real optimal level or natural level for the economy. But you're going to end up at a different price level, and it was a bumpy road to get there. So you're hoping to find the natural level of basic income that corresponds to the current price level instead of a different price level, right? And that allows you to kind of more smoothly transition. Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
I think when you talk about economic incentives, again, there's this enormous sort of overemphasis on labor incentives, and this is true for both this book and also for mainstream economists, for everybody across the board. And one of the things that they leave out is the incentives of businesses. And one of the most important things that occurs when you don't have a basic income and you are not activating, you're not getting enough aggregate demand in the economy, is that labor demand and wages are affected in the downwards direction. They're held back. And when labor wages are low, one of the enormous incentives which is reduced for businesses is that if labor is not that expensive, then businesses are less incentivized to invest in automation, which could, vastly increase the productivity of the economy. So that's a huge one that gets ignored, and it's enormous in terms of how much less you're doing in the economy than you could. And then the other incentive is that, with the system set up the way it is, with stimulus going in only into debt markets and only for lowering the interest rates, that also sort of reduces the incentive of businesses. It reduces the importance for businesses of increasing revenue and profits, because it's reducing the discount rate. It's reducing the sort of the relevance of the income of the business, and it's increasing sort of the speculative nature of financial markets. It's increasing financial bubbles, and it's increasing the incentive of, I guess, the wealthy and the business, the capital side of things, to just to ride those bubbles instead of actually working to satisfy the consumer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you're propping up demand, if you're backstopping consumers and ensuring they have enough income to keep the price level up, if you're doing that by stimulating the financial sector, then what you're doing is you're making it cheaper for businesses to borrow so they can hire people. But meanwhile, businesses are not necessarily going to be borrowing efficiently, and they're, if they can roll over their debt indefinitely very cheaply, they're not necessarily going to have a very productive business model. A lot of that borrowing might go in, you just turn around and go into more lending, and then you get these speculative feedback loops and bubbles in asset prices, right? So there's you do achieve the effect of keeping the consumer price level up, but it's at the cost of the side effect of blowing up asset prices when you keep interest rates too low. So basic income allows you to hand people their money directly instead of doing all that. So you can have tighter monetary policy, and you can have a tighter financial sector. And I like that you brought up that incentives are about more than just the labor market, right? We really don't know we can make some guesses, but we really don't know the answer to the question of, how people's incentives are going to change if we replace some of this, kind of job creation and monetary stimulus with basic income, or at least we don't know the magnitudes specifically, right? But it doesn't matter, right? It just changes what level of basic income we're going to end up settling on. All you need to do is say all of these things are going to change people's incentives. So let's find out what our economy can do. Let's find out what an efficient labor market and efficient financial sector looks like, and then you'll have the answer to that question. You don't need to predict it ahead of time in order to get it right. You can feel for what the optimal level of basic income is. So let's go to the next one here. In countries with both a developed income tax system and a developed welfare state, by far the most obvious way of funding basic income is through the personal income tax. It is the one adopted in most proposals worked out in detail. It is also the only one that lends itself to a formal equivalence with a negative income tax, as discussed in Chapter 2. So this is interesting that if people kind of by default go to kind of pair basic income with an income tax. So there's kind of two steps here. One is that they kind of assume that it has to be funded. There has to be an equal amount of taxation to spending. And then the way they choose to kind of fund it is through this mechanism of kind of redistributing money from rich people to everyone else, right? So there's this idea that the money is kind of out there and it just needs to be redistributed. I definitely, you can have a basic income and you can pair it with an income tax. If you keep the income tax at exactly the same level as the basic income, my sense is that you're probably not gonna get an optimal basic income, and you're not going to get an optimal income tax, right? You're trying to do two things, and the right answer, to basic income is, the question I like to start with. This is why I like to start with the question of, if we didn't make any other changes to fiscal policy, what would the optimal level of basic income be? Once you start looking at the effects of taxes, it can start to get complicated, right? There's some configuration of income tax that will actually reduce the level of basic income we can sustain. For example, if you taxed everyone's income at 100%, then nobody's going to go out and work, and you're not going to be able to afford to give anyone any basic income because they'll have nothing to spend it on, right? So there's kind of a Laffer curve, that kind of thing there. But it's this idea that there's this kind of one-to-one, you collect the tax revenue and then the basic income. Well, there's some level of basic income that's optimal in our current fiscal position. No other changes to our existing fiscal policy. So I think the first part of this chapter talks about income tax. Later parts of the chapter talk about alternatives, and they talk about, kind of tax-free kind of funding alternatives as well. They're not really framing it in the way that I do, that, the economy needs a mechanism to get money to consumers, and what's that mechanism going to be. So let's go to the next quote here. The simplest way of formulating this challenge is very misleading. Oh, this is a big one. It consists of multiplying the proposed level of basic income by the population concerned, calculating how highly taxable personal income would need to be taxed in order to yield this amount, the amount of the basic income, and adding the corresponding tax rate to the pre-existing tax burden. In the context of countries with developed welfare states and tax systems, this does not make sense, because much of the basic income would be self-financed, quote unquote, in two ways. As mentioned in chapter 1, it would replace all lower social assistance or insurance benefits and the lower part of all higher social benefits. And it would also replace tax exemptions on the lower income brackets of all households, and possibly a number of other tax expenditures, for example, on childcare services or private pensions. So this kind of language is frustrating to me. And I feel like talk like this tends to make people very skeptical of basic income. The main thing that basic income replaces is jobs and unstable private credit as sources of consumer income. Now you can ask the question, once you've done that, once you've gotten all that straightened out, you can ask, do we need any of these other programs? If we reduce them, is that going to increase the level of, you can start making trade-offs, right? And sometimes the trade-offs are worth it and sometimes they're not. But just having basic income as a tool, as something you're automatically going to use to kind of fill the gap in consumer income when you don't want to use jobs and you don't want to use private credit, that's kind of an important step on its own, and they're kind of skipping over that step there. And then there's also this thing about net costs and gross costs. So here's the next quote. With higher levels of basic income, the net cost would obviously grow, but it would remain much smaller than the gross cost, and it is the net cost that matters. So this is the idea that you have basic income and it's paired with some tax, and you want to net out the tax with the basic income, and then what's left is kind of the what you have to figure out how to fund or something like that. So if you have a negative income tax, for example, there's an implied income tax combined with a basic income, that kind of thing. So I'm not a huge fan of the net cost versus gross cost arguments. I think it's kind of a red herring. And I think if you find yourself arguing with a basic income skeptic about net costs and gross costs, you've probably already lost the argument because you're arguing about something that doesn't matter. What does it even mean for basic income to have a cost, right? Are you going in assuming that it's going to be a certain amount or something like that? Like, why not just say like, hey, there's this mechanism we can use. There are these other mechanisms we use now, and you can compare and contrast. Like, oh, well, this is obviously inefficient, employing people for the sake of pushing money to them. This is obviously inefficient, stimulating the asset markets in order to prop up consumers. You can do basic income instead of those things. And the numbers don't really matter. We discover the numbers. We find out by implementing it and gradually increasing the amount and seeing what works for the economy. So if you're getting into net cost and gross cost, then you're already kind of like conceding this perspective that, basic income has to be funded by taxes and, that kind of thing. So I tend to, when I hear this, I feel like, people are getting kind of going down rabbit holes and, not seeing the big picture anymore. They're getting into details that aren't really super important. I would say, the distinction between net costs and gross costs misses the point, which is that the costs, especially the monetary costs, are not the right way to think about basic income. Basic income is just a mechanism for money distribution. Is it more efficient than the alternative mechanisms? Does it do a better job of distributing money in a way that promotes people's well-being? This is the question we need to be addressing, not what the specific numbers are, right? The numbers are going to be whatever's appropriate for what your economy can handle. So let's see. Yeah, and then there's more stuff about labor incentives. And I think, even if you ignore the effects on aggregate demand of the basic income, it's still the case that some reduction in work incentives is optimal because we're currently overemploying people. So this is, it's not that the goal is to give people more freedom. It's that the goal is that you don't want to unnecessarily do inefficient things. You don't want to take away people's freedom if you don't need to. Right. And that's kind of what the current system does. There's a limit to how much freedom you can give people because we need to have some incentives, but it's not about like either you're free or you're not. And a basic income makes you free. It's that you're more free or less free, and you're less free if we try to force money to people through the labor market and force people to kind of get jobs and that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
One of they're sort of falling into this this wrong term. They're falling into this problem of making the assumption that there's sort of a finite amount of money, and you have to tax the fund. You can't increase the amount of money supply in a certain way to actually increase production. So there's a lot of things about MMT that I really disagree with. But the one thing that I agree with is that we're underrunning the productive capacity of the economy, and this is one of the reasons I really like the name CMT, the Consumer Monetary Theory, and I think that is really core. That you do have to jump out of that assumption and realize that there are ways. There are ways to put money into the economy that will affect the economy itself, that will increase production, and so it's not a zero-sum game. If you're stuck in a zero-sum game, you're right. All the arguments of the critics seem to be correct. It seems to be as if we're just shuffling things around, and what is almost what is the point really? Whereas the main thing is that that you are underutilizing capacity. You can put money supply into the hands of consumers, and that will increase production. You'll get a huge net benefit. There's one other thing that I wanted to say and I forgot. So,
all right, well, feel free to raise your hand again.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, well, basic income caused people to stop working. And, I'm always like, yes, well, that's the point. we only want people to work if we actually need them to work. We don't want it. We don't want the jobs to be just existing to get people money. So I think people are worried about things with respect to basic income that are actually true. They just don't need to be worried about them. But sometimes you see basic income supporters come back and say, no, there's such and such a study showed that people don't actually quit their jobs, that kind of thing. Well, if some people aren't quitting their jobs and people aren't working less, then maybe your basic income isn't high enough, right? So let's go on to the next quote here. More is needed if we are to gain and spread confidence in the sustainability of a generous basic income, to be able to make informed guesses about what would happen if such a basic income were introduced. It must be possible to do better than asking people what they would do if they were given a basic income at a particular level. One can conduct experiments and construct simulation models. So this is kind of a little pet peeve of mine as well. There's a lot of people in kind of the basic income movement who like to ask this question. They're like, we go around and ask people, what would you do if you had, such and such amount of money, no strings attached? And they give these great answers about how productive they're going to be, that kind of thing. But then when you ask them what other people would do, other people are going to waste it on booze or something like that. These are not the right questions to be asking people, because it's a question about, is the market gonna, is the economy gonna be able to continue operating correctly? And asking people specifically anecdotally what they would do with the basic income is not. I mean, maybe it's a marketing tactic, sure, but it was never particularly appealing to me. I started seeing it around 2013. People were asking this question. It's not the right question to ask. We have to ask, well, how does it affect the macroeconomy, right? And you can't know that by asking individual people things. And I think the intuition is right? Like if you ask people, what's the overall effect of giving people free money going to be? People are going to be like, well, people won't have to work as much, so maybe they won't work as much. There's less incentive, at least along some dimensions, to sell your labor because you're not as desperate for it, and that's fine. That's actually the right answer. So it's I think. I think that's just, I don't know that conducting experiments and constructing simulation models is necessarily going to get you the answer either, unless your simulation models are based on good theory and your experiments. The experiments they talk about, really all they're testing is labor market effects again, which again isn't going to tell you what you need to know. If you're going in assuming that, we want people to have as much incentive to work as possible, then you're going in with the wrong mindset and you're going in with the wrong questions. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think behind that is some kind of concern that we are benefiting from all the labor that is currently being done, and thus we would be losing something beneficial. I don't think this idea of kind of useless labor that we want to eliminate is on people's radar, at least unless you frame the question in the right way. So I think there are just a lot of assumptions in there that lead to that answer.
Yeah, that's right. And the problem isn't just that you can't get an accurate picture of people's long-term, large-scale behavior. It's that we don't actually know, or most people, when they're asking these questions, they don't actually know what kind of behavior they want out of people, or what kind of behavior our society wants out of people. What's the right level of incentives? What's the right pattern of incentives, right? Does people's behavior even matter in evaluating the prospects of basic income? I would probably say no. It only affects kind of the parameters for the basic income, what level of basic income the economy can sustain. So if you're running an experiment to see how people spend their money, well, that's a silly experiment from a scientific point of view, because it's money, right? People spend their money how they spend it. And the question is, how do you get it to them most efficiently? People need money. You need a source of money for people. What's it going to be? Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
Right. Exactly what Bethany said. Another related assumption here, when you fail to that you need to fix, is this idea, and economists use this all the time also, that if you decrease the labor supply, then then that will necessarily cause a reduction in production, and so, this chapter, you can view it as that, and also what a lot of economists, talk about with these labor incentives. They are making that assumption. That is not actually true. There is a underutilization of labor in the economy, where when you're keeping labor wages low, people, businesses don't use the labor efficiently. Whereas if you boosted up labor aggregate demand, labor demand went up and labor prices go up, and then labor becomes very scarce, then businesses, have to find a way to use people efficiently, or else that will affect their profit. But if you keep the labor wages low, then they don't have as much of that incentive, and so that's that is a false. Economics is full of these sort of algebraic analyses where we're like trying to add things up and figure out if things increase or decrease, but the equation is sometimes wrong, and so that's one of the equations where you have capital plus labor equals production, but that is false, because you have to add a utilization function in there to represent how the capital is being utilized, whether that's efficient, how the labor is being utilized, if that's efficient, and if that efficiency goes up, as it would with basic income, then that equality no longer holds true, and these arguments are not correct.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest differences between like classical and neoclassical economists, which is the classical economists said that the output is worth kind of the inputs that you put into it, the capital and the labor, and then the neoclassicals came along and they said, this is like Menger and Walras and Jevons. They came along and said, well, what really matters is how useful the thing is that you made. That's what gives it value, and that's what's gonna, people are gonna pay for it or demand it based on that, not based on how much labor, how much capital went into that. So you have this kind of marginal utility, or this utility-based theory of value. This kind of it's more of an output value theory than an input value theory, and I think that makes a lot more sense, because if you have an input value theory, then there's no way you can talk about wasting inputs, right? There's no way you can talk about digging holes and filling them back in again as a wasteful process, because you're just calculating things based on, oh, well, he put in a certain amount of labor, therefore it's worth a certain amount. And obviously they never took it to that extreme, but it was kind of like, this assumption that you get what you put into it. Well, you can put things in really inefficient ways, and that's not helpful. But yeah, you're right. So what matters is what we're getting out of the economy, not what we're putting into it. What we're putting into it matters too, but it serves what we get out of it. So labor matters insofar as how it contributes to the output, and the same thing is true with capital and materials and other inputs. If you chop down a forest and burn all the trees, and call that an economic process, you're just wasting the trees. You're not creating value there. So that's an important distinction that kind of emerged at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So let's see, let's go to the next quote here. Even the best designed experiments cannot capture the effects on the labor market, which are at the core of the case for basic income versus conditional minimum income schemes. So they're arguing about kind of the welfare cliffs inherent in conditional minimum income schemes. But I don't think this is the core. Again, I would kind of flip it and frame it the other way, that you want markets to be efficient and you don't want to introduce any kind of perverse incentives or anything like that. So the goal of basic income isn't to have a system. The goal of basic income and the case for basic income isn't to make the labor market more efficient as much as it is to just get people money directly and not have to use these other mechanisms that make the labor market less efficient. And not just the labor market, but other markets too, right? If we focus only, like Eddie was saying, if we focus only on the labor market, then we're not seeing the whole picture. And if you're not getting people money efficiently, it messes with a lot of markets, and the labor market is one of them. Let's see. So yeah, you don't, and the other thing is that you don't need to capture the effects on the labor market. You just need to know that creating jobs to push people money is inefficient. So let's go to the next quote here. Owing to the interest they keep triggering in the media, even when they are just mere possibilities that may never materialize, all quote unquote basic income experiments are wonderful insofar as they boost awareness of the idea and discussion about its pros and cons. But if their relevance to either the sustainability or the desirability of basic income is inappropriately framed, their net effect on real life reform in this direction may turn out to be disastrous. Yeah, I think that's right. And anything that's designed to kind of like test labor market incentives is not testing the right thing. I think there are kind of demonstrations and pilot programs that are explicitly not trying to do anything scientific, and they're just trying to kind of tell people stories and inspire people about the ideas. I think that's probably the best you can do with these things. You're not going to learn anything. You're not going to gather any useful economic data or anything like that. And if you're, the Finland experiment, for example, they wanted to see if giving people a basic income actually increased their labor participation. And why would you want that as an outcome? That seems kind of perverse in itself. In the end, it didn't really have much of an effect at all. The amount that they were giving out and the context in terms of who they were giving it to didn't have much of an effect on people's labor incentives. It certainly didn't increase people's desire to work, and that wouldn't be why we would want to give people a basic income anyway. So I'm not too worried about that. I am worried about, when you have these experiments out there and you have these pilot programs out there that, they don't get the results that they're looking for. So people think of it as like, oh, basic income is a failure. This, experiment showed that it's a failure, that kind of thing. Well, it failed to do this thing that it's not really supposed to do. So that's okay. But, you're not going to get that far with a lot of people. They're just going to think of basic income as this thing that was kind of tried in these experiments and didn't work out. Turns out it wasn't feasible or something like that. So we need to be careful about these experiments, and we need to be careful in general about kind of the arguments we use to promote basic income. If we're saying that, people won't buy booze and drugs, the next thing, that's going to happen is someone's going to come up with an anecdote or an example of where, the opposite happened. Right. But the reality is that basic income is money, and, people spend money on anything, and that includes stuff you don't want them to spend it on. Right. That doesn't change the fact that you need a mechanism to get people money, and that money is an important part of the economy. But I think there's this sense of paternalism, it kind of comes back to this expectation of work again, that if people didn't earn the money, then they're somehow spending someone else's money, and, they better be using it, appropriately or something like that. They don't get the same freedom that the people who earned their money get. Well, the people who earned their money, by and large, earned their money through jobs that were stimulated into existence through monetary policy. So people are getting government handouts, and they're just, those handouts are hidden behind the fact that the government is also handing out jobs. The money handouts are hidden behind the job handouts, which are hidden behind the market, right? Because the government is stimulating the market to create the jobs. But it's still, it's still the same kind of thing. How do you get people the money? And we've got these kind of cultural expectations and social expectations that you earn money through a job, even if that's not necessarily efficient in aggregate. So there's a lot we kind of need to get past psychologically in order to accept basic income. And it can happen in either order, or it can happen gradually. If we implement a basic income and people start living in a world with basic income, I think that's helpful. I think they'll still start to come around, right? When you start to see the markets work efficiently, and everyone having access, and minimization of poverty, and you're not having a business cycle of asset bubbles and crashes anymore, and all these recessions that are due to problems in the financial sector. Once people are living in that world, they'll wonder, well, how were they ever living without a basic income? But you have to some extent, convince at least some people before it's implemented. Otherwise, it'll never get implemented. So I guess the question is, who do we have to convince? Is it the general public? Is the popular kind of movement out there, what's going to get us the basic income? Or do we need to take an approach of really somehow getting to the experts, becoming economists ourselves or something like that? That's kind of the direction I lean. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough nut to crack, getting people on board with this. And not just, you can get a lot of people on board with something that sounds exciting, like free money. How do you get people who think deeply about these things and have a deep understanding of the economy and of economic policy on board with something like this, when it kind of goes against their models, not just their formal models, but their mental models of how the economy is supposed to work, with people getting their money through jobs. So let's go to the next one here. Speaking of models, here now we're talking about econometric models. Applying the estimated tax elasticities for the various categories to the changes in income levels and marginal tax rates to which their incomes are subjected yields a prediction of the effect on the labor supply. Typically, for reasons spelled out earlier in this chapter, with the help of a stylized comparison, workers whose total net income is increased as a result of receiving basic income, but whose marginal income shrinks as a result of funding it, will be predicted to reduce their working time quite substantially. So that sounds great to me. It's interesting that when they're talking about the models, the econometric models, they're still looking at the labor market effects. So, we could ask, is there some economic modeling, some econometric modeling that we could use that doesn't really care about specific incentives in the labor market, and just wants to look at, well, how do we kind of, as Eddie is saying, how do we bring the economy to full output as efficiently as possible? How do we use our resources as efficiently as possible? And full output means full output given the constraints of our other fiscal policy, right? So maybe we're using fiscal policy to conserve resources, so full output is less. But you still want to be using your resources as efficiently as possible, and to be benefiting people as efficiently as possible. Sometimes people object when I use the word efficient, because they think that, economic efficiency is divorced from kind of reality or something like that. But when I say efficient, I just mean getting the results you want at a minimum cost, right? The maximum output for the minimum input. So we want, if you have the right model of how the economy works, then you can do these kinds of calculations, and maybe you can make estimates about what the level of basic income could be and what the effect on the labor market could be. You also don't really, it's not necessarily a bad thing if a lot of people quit their jobs. That's important to keep in mind too. Yeah, so let's close out of this one. There's some more stuff about econometric modeling in here. Then there's some stuff about the idea of the state owning the means of production, and then whether the state owns a specific resource or all resources, what it means for the public to own the means of production. I think we can, it's partly a matter of framing. With basic income, you could say that if you're giving people money, that's giving everyone access to economic output. So that's a share of ownership. Your income is a share of ownership in the economy's productive capacity. But the problem is that if you're thinking of it in terms of, well, you have to fund it based on owning the economic output, based on owning, an oil pipeline and selling the oil or something like that, then you're not going to get the right answer. Because the optimal level of basic income for the economy, the optimal level of consumer spending for the economy in terms of real purchasing power, has to do with what the economy can sell to people. What are the resources that are available to produce goods and services? That's the appropriate amount of money to go out there. So the fact that you're, selling one resource or something like that, or that the government happens to be controlling specific resources, is not necessarily going to tell you the answer for what the optimal basic income is going to be. And then they get into oh yeah, there's this part where they talk about in a socialist economy, the government is allocating everything. What's the role of money? Can you have a basic income without taxes? I think there are a lot of questions in here. So let's go to the money section. Let me bring up a quote. This might be the last one we do. So this idea, they're talking about the idea of creating money, issuing money to pay for basic income. This idea has usually been dismissed as relying on simplistic economies and as overlooking the deleterious effect of the inflationary pressures its implementation would generate. However, there are two sound rationales for funding either a very modest or a temporary basic income through money creation. The first one, articulated most systematically by Joseph Huber, supposes that central banks can regain, at the expense of private banks, the monopoly of money creation. They can then issue drawing rights to all residents. If these match the annual growth of the real economy, they will not cause inflation. If they exceed it, they will, but a moderate non-accelerating inflation rate is arguably a good thing to grease the cyclical fluctuations and structural change. There is some unavoidable uncertainty about the rate of real growth one can expect, and some unavoidable fuzziness about the rate of inflation deemed appropriate. Yet this argument makes room for a sensible monetary funding at a level that would need to fluctuate and could not exceed by much the rate of real growth. So I think this is, they're talking about this as being kind of a sound rationale. I think this kind of depends on the assumption that there's a certain amount of money out there that just keeps circulating again and again to activate the economy's output. So you want to, so the amount of money, the money stock corresponds to a level of spending. And then as the economy becomes more productive, you increase the money stock, maybe through a basic income like mechanism, and that lets you activate more of the activate the additional capacity that's being created. I don't think that's the right way to think about basic income, because I don't think the level of spending is directly tied to kind of like the amount of money out there. It's more tied to well, what are people's incomes, right? So if you have a model of the economy where all the money magically cycles back to people through jobs, then you can kind of create an equivalence between kind of the amount of money and the level of spending. But if you have an economy where some people just like to accumulate money forever or something like that, then really what you need is you need to look at the source of money. What's the source of money for consumers? If it's not cycling back to them through jobs, then what's it going to be? And if it's not basic income, then what's it going to be, right? So it's more about the flow of money than it is about the stock of money in the economy. And you, as you know, kind of I was mentioning before, you can have a basic income, even in an economy that's not growing, even in an economy that's shrinking. Consumers are still going to need a source of money. The average consumer is going to need a source of money. And there's nothing that's automatically going to give them money in just the way the economy works on its own without a basic income. So we need to pay attention to that. Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
I think there were just only two words in that paragraph that were really accurate. and those were fuzziness and uncertainty. Because I think the authors are sort of in the same place. If you look at in the last month, maybe, I think there was an interview of Larry Summers on No Opinion, the the blogger.
Noah Smith,
and you can just tell Noah Smith. Yeah, you can just tell that he sort of doesn't know what's going to happen. He's sort of hedging and saying, well, maybe we'll get inflation, maybe things will go downwards. And there is, they're looking at they're not looking at the right issues. With the authors here, they're saying, if you sort of decrease the bank money supply, then that will allow you to not have inflation. But that's not actually how you tell whether you're going to have inflation or not. You can tell if you're going to have capacity constrained inflation or not by, is capacity being fully utilized, and capacity utilization measures that are at century lows. So you're not, and it doesn't, again, it's back to this sort of, unexamined assumption about, increases in the money supply necessarily causing inflation or whatever. And that's just, sort of this fear of increasing the money supply. But it's just not the right area to look. Where you should be looking is, are we overrunning capacity? And the answer to that is no, we're not.
Yeah, and I noticed that you qualified in there, inflation that's caused by capacity constraints, because a lot of the inflation that we see has nothing to do with being up against our economy's capacity. It has to do with the fact that, demand is distributed in such a way that it's profitable for producers to produce lower quantities at higher prices and that kind of thing. So we're actually not... you can have inflation at any level of economic output, all the way up to full output. You could have inflation at half output, at 1/5 output, that kind of thing. If you're stimulating demand through monetary policy, right? And you're really kind of money is leaking out of asset prices and into wages, and some people have a lot of money and then other people have no money, and you produce for the people who have money and not for the people who don't, that kind of thing. So really, I think people who aren't familiar with me and Eddie, I think he's much more into kind of this capacity utilization stat than I am. I think inflation is not an indicator of full capacity utilization. Certainly, if you do have full capacity utilization and you throw more money at the economy, that will cause inflation, but that's not the kind of inflation that we see normally. So we're at the end.
I'm quite curious. I'm quite curious about what you think. On another episode, we're gonna have to talk about what you think about inflation in the middle of that range. I think that the risk of inflation right now is that we have sort of a wrong shaped money supply with too much money supply at the top, with no productive outlet, because the real investment is frustrated by lack of consumption demand. And so all the money in the hands of the capitalists, when they can't invest it into more factories, it starts going into speculative bubbles. They're just looking for anywhere to place their money, and that when it goes into, say, commodity markets, and other things, that does actually create a risk of a very bad type of inflation.
Yeah. Well, we're getting toward the end, but I want to go to Robert if you have a comment.
Oh, thanks, Alex. Alex, you talk about the basic income being simply a mechanism for getting people money, and you compare that to the labour market. So how do I talk to somebody about that? Like, how do I draw those two things apart?
Yeah, it depends. It depends who you're talking to. Like, sometimes I talk to people who insist that people should get their money through jobs. And then the question I would ask someone like that usually would be, does that mean that you would support creating jobs for people as a way to get the money? And that usually rattles something in their minds. Creating make work just to push money to people. I think that's inefficient on the face of it. And I think most people kind of recognize that. And then if they say no to that, you wouldn't want to do that. Then I would get into, well, this is what we do. It's just not obvious. It's kind of hidden behind the scenes. And basic income means we don't have to do that anymore.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
Yep. So this was a good discussion, you guys. We have 2 more chapters in this book. Next week is chapter 7, Politically Achievable, Civil Society, Parties, and the Back Door. So we're going to get more into the politics of basic income next week. Thanks, everybody.
Alex, just one word. Do you recommend the book?
It's probably the best book on basic income there is. And it's going to give you a sense of kind of like where the mainstream thinking on basic income is, as well as kind of like windows into different perspectives. I don't think there is a good book on basic income yet.
Maybe you should write it, Alex.
I am writing it. Yeah.
Oh, good man. Good man. I look forward to that.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll see. Maybe in 10 years it'll be ready, but I've been working on it for a while.
I can't wait 10 years. I'll be 84 in 10 years' time.
Oh no! All right. Well, I'll have to speed it up then.
You will.
Thanks for letting me know. I wouldn't have realized otherwise. All right. Thanks, guys. This was a great discussion. Same time.